You've been lied to about effort. It is not repetition that manifests. It is identity. The state you occupy hardens into fact. Neville Goddard exposed this illusion with a simplicity so direct that many people overlooked it. He did not teach effort. He revealed nature. Assumption, he said, is effortless not because it is easy, but because it is already happening. You do not assume as a technique. You assume as an identity. To believe you must do something to assume is to misunderstand what assumption is. It is not an action layered on top of consciousness. It is the operating condition of consciousness itself. The mistake was never failing to assume. The mistake was assuming you had to earn the right to do what you were already doing. Neville used an analogy that cut straight through the confusion: trying to earn your own name. Imagine waking up every morning attempting to qualify for the name you were given at birth, rehearsing it, proving it, working to deserve it. The absurdity is obvious, yet this is precisely how most people treat their desires. They behave as though being wealthy, loved, secure, or free is a title that must be granted after sufficient labor, rather than a state that can be occupied the moment it is accepted. The name was never given because you earned it. It was given because it was yours. Assumption works the same way. Techniques were never introduced as replacements for assumption. They were signposts, temporary scaffolding meant to point attention back to the one thing that actually creates, the inner acceptance of a state as true. But over time, the scaffolding became the structure. The reminder became the ritual. What was meant to reveal power slowly became something people relied on instead of it. The irony is subtle but devastating. Using techniques to try to assume only reinforces the belief that assumption is not already present. The moment effort enters, separation is declared. Modern neuroscience quietly echoes the same truth from a different angle. Joe Dispenza explains that effort is not neutral, it carries information. Effort signals lack. Strain tells the body and mind that the desired state is absent and must be chased. Coherence, on the other hand, signals possession. When thought, feeling, and identity align without force, the system behaves as though the outcome is already secured. Creation does not respond to tension, it responds to agreement. This is not mystical language, it is observable coherence. Freedom begins at a very precise moment, the moment you stop trying to deserve what you want. Not when you master the perfect method, not when you finally feel worthy after years of work, but when the internal transaction ends. When you see that nothing was ever being sold. Assumption is free because it was never a product. It was your nature quietly operating beneath every effort, every ritual, every attempt to get what you believed you lacked. And the instant you recognize that, the search softens, the pressure dissolves, and something deeper than effort takes its place: authority. At first glance, effort looks virtuous. It feels responsible, disciplined, even noble. The more you try, the more committed you believe you are. But beneath that surface lies a quieter signal that rarely gets questioned. Trying is not neutral. Trying is a confession. It quietly announces that what you want is not here, not now, and not yet yours. The very energy of effort carries separation within it, and separation is the language of doubt, no matter how spiritual the words wrapped around it may sound. Consider the strange image of knocking on a door you already live behind. From the outside, the knocking appears reasonable. It looks like persistence, but from the inside it is unnecessary and slightly absurd. This is exactly how effort functions when applied to assumption. If you already occupy a state, there is no door to open. The knocking itself proves you believe you are still outside. Effort, in this sense, is not a bridge to the desired state. It is evidence that you think a bridge is needed at all. This is why effort never feels complete. There is always another affirmation to repeat, another session to schedule, another ritual to refine. The mind remains busy because it is unconvinced. It keeps working, not because creation requires labor, but because doubt demands reassurance. Effort becomes the currency paid to quiet anxiety, not the means by which reality is shaped. And yet, the more this currency is spent, the deeper the belief in separation becomes, reinforcing the very condition it was meant to dissolve. Here the disruption begins to take form. If trying implies distance, then effort cannot be the creative force it was assumed to be. Something else must be doing the work quietly, continuously, without strain. Something must already be functioning beneath the rituals, beneath the repetition, beneath the fatigue. The question shifts subtly but powerfully. If effort blocks assumption rather than produces it, then what is actually creating the movement of life? And in that question, the old economy of struggle begins to collapse. Long before you learned the language of effort, you were already assuming. Before methods, before discipline, before anyone taught you how to manifest, consciousness was functioning in its natural state. Assumption was not something you performed, it was something you lived inside of. As a child, you did not rehearse belief or question whether imagining was working. You moved through the world expecting continuity, expecting response, expecting life to reflect you. That expectation was not effortful. It was instinctive, and because it was instinctive, it was powerful. This is why assumption can be described as the default operating system of consciousness. It runs quietly in the background, shaping perception, reaction, and experience without asking for permission. You assume the ground will hold you when you walk. You assume the sun will rise. You assume your name when it is called, without proving it belongs to you. None of these assumptions require technique, repetition, or emotional intensity. They function because they are unchallenged. They feel easy, not because they are weak, but because they are settled. Trying to learn assumption is like taking a class on breathing. The act itself is natural, but once attention becomes strained, the rhythm is disrupted. You begin to inhale and exhale with effort, turning something automatic into something awkward. In the same way, assumption only feels difficult once it becomes self-conscious. The moment you start monitoring it, correcting it, or forcing it, the natural flow is interrupted. What once happened effortlessly now feels like work, not because the mechanism changed, but because trust was replaced with control. This leads to the deeper question that many avoid. If assumption is natural, why does it feel so difficult now? The answer is not failure, and it is not lack of talent or discipline. Difficulty arises because assumption has been overlaid with doubt, guilt, and the belief that imagination must be justified. The original simplicity was never lost, it was merely buried under layers of learned effort, and as this reversal becomes clear, the struggle begins to look less like a necessity and more like a misunderstanding that can quietly dissolve. If effort was never the price, stay here. Subscribe and remember what assumption already gives you. Techniques did not arise from deception or manipulation. They were born from a sincere attempt to make something subtle more accessible. When inner states felt elusive, structure offered reassurance. A method gave the mind something to hold, something familiar in a world that does not respond to force in the usual way. In their earliest use, techniques acted like training wheels for awareness, not because assumption was weak, but because trust had not yet stabilized. They were meant to be temporary companions, not permanent authorities. Over time, however, the relationship quietly inverted. Instead of techniques pointing back to assumption, assumption was postponed until the technique felt complete. The method became a gatekeeper. The inner state was treated as a reward rather than a starting point. This subtle shift transformed creation into a conditional process, where reality was expected to respond only after sufficient mental labor had been performed. Trust, once central, was slowly outsourced to form. The imagination was no longer trusted on its own. It needed validation through repetition, structure, and effort. This is where techniques begin to function as substitutes rather than supports. When reliance forms, the method absorbs the faith that once belonged to being. The question is no longer whether the state feels true, but whether the technique was done correctly. Attention moves away from identity and into performance. The inner world becomes monitored, corrected, and managed, as though assumption were fragile and required constant supervision. In this environment, trust cannot deepen, because trust cannot coexist with constant checking. The training wheels metaphor becomes especially revealing here. They are useful only until balance is learned, but balance itself never comes from the wheels. It emerges when the rider releases dependence and allows the body to organize naturally. If the wheels remain, true balance is never tested, never embodied. In the same way, techniques can prevent the very stabilization they were meant to encourage. The mind remains focused on the external act instead of the internal agreement, and assumption remains something practiced rather than something lived. There is also an emotional cost to this dependence that often goes unnoticed. When results appear inconsistent, the method is blamed, refined, or replaced. Doubt increases, not decreases, because the source of power feels unreliable. This leads to accumulation rather than simplicity. More techniques are added, more rules are followed, more effort is applied. What began as guidance slowly becomes burden. The individual feels responsible for maintaining reality through constant inner labor, which quietly reinforces the belief that reality would collapse without vigilance. Trust erodes further under this pressure. The natural ease of assumption becomes associated with irresponsibility, while effort is equated with seriousness and commitment. Rest feels undeserved. Simplicity feels suspicious. The imagination is treated as something that must be disciplined rather than honored. In this state, techniques do not merely assist, they replace the direct relationship with consciousness. The structure becomes the focus, and the living center is forgotten. Removing techniques exposes this imbalance immediately. Without the familiar ritual, the mind feels naked. There is nothing to measure progress against, nothing to complete, nothing to check off. This exposure is often interpreted as loss, but it is actually the return of direct contact. The discomfort that arises is not evidence that something is missing. It is evidence that control is loosening. What surfaces in that moment is the habit of mistrust, the belief that without effort, nothing moves. Yet it is precisely here that power begins to reappear. When techniques fall away, assumption stands alone, unsupported and undeniable. There is no longer a process to hide behind, no ritual to blame or credit. Identity becomes the only currency. This is where trust stops being an idea and becomes a condition. The mind learns, often reluctantly, that reality does not require constant supervision. Movement continues, not because it is managed, but because it is natural. In this way, techniques reveal their final purpose by disappearing. They were never meant to be carried forever. Their role was to point attention back to the one thing that cannot be improved by effort, being. When that is recognized, trust is no longer something sought through practice. It becomes the quiet confidence of assumption itself, stable not because it is enforced, but because it no longer needs to be. For most of life, identity is quietly trained around action. You learn early that movement earns response, that effort brings results, and that doing is how value is measured. Over time, this conditioning settles so deeply that it feels like common sense. To exist is to strive. To want is to work. Within this framework, the self becomes a doer by default, measuring worth through activity and progress through visible motion. This identity feels solid because it is familiar, not because it is fundamental. Assumption introduces a radical reversal. It does not ask what you are doing, it reveals what you are being. Being always precedes action, even when this order is ignored. Every action flows from an inner position already accepted as true, whether consciously or unconsciously. The doer believes action creates identity, but the assumer recognizes that identity authorizes action. This difference is subtle in language, yet immense in consequence. When identity shifts, behavior reorganizes without force. The image of a king makes this distinction unmistakable. A king does not rehearse authority or practice being royal. Authority is recognized, not performed. Orders do not carry power because of volume or repetition, but because of the position from which they arise. In the same way, assumption does not work because of intensity or duration. It works because it issues from a settled inner position. When identity is clear, effort becomes unnecessary. Not because nothing happens, but because everything flows. The doer lives in anticipation. There is always a sense of preparing for a future state that has not yet arrived. The assumer lives in recognition. The state is already accepted internally, and time simply organizes itself around that acceptance. This does not produce passivity. It produces alignment. Action still occurs, but it no longer feels strained or strategic. It feels obvious, almost incidental, as though life is responding rather than being pushed. This shift often feels unsettling at first because it removes familiar reference points. Without the constant activity of doing, the mind searches for proof of effectiveness. It wants reassurance in the form of effort, repetition, or visible struggle. When those are absent, doubt surfaces, not because assumption has failed, but because identity is reorganizing. The doer feels displaced, while the assumer has not yet been fully inhabited. The transition happens most clearly in a specific inner condition, one where effort naturally quiets and identity softens. In that condition, there is no need to convince, persuade, or reinforce. The state feels given rather than achieved. This is not an emotional high or a dramatic realization. It is a calm recognition, often so ordinary that it is overlooked. Yet it is here that the shift becomes permanent, because being no longer depends on doing to justify itself. As this identity stabilizes, something remarkable occurs. Desire loses its edge. Wanting transforms into knowing. The urgency that once drove effort dissolves, replaced by a steady inner permission. Life begins to mirror this change, not through struggle, but through coherence. The assumer does not force outcomes into existence. Outcomes arrange themselves around the identity that no longer argues with itself. This is why the movement from doer to assumer is not a technique to master, but an identity to remember. It does not require discipline, only honesty. When the inner position is claimed, the outer world responds without resistance. And in that response, the old identity quietly fades, no longer needed, no longer convincing, because something more fundamental has taken its place. There is a quiet misunderstanding surrounding the state akin to sleep, one that turns something gentle into something mechanical. SATS was never meant to be approached as a ceremony or a sequence of steps executed with precision. It is not a posture, a breathing pattern, or a visualization schedule. At its core, it is a moment of surrender, a natural softening of the inner world where resistance loosens and identity becomes impressionable. When ritual is layered on top of it, the simplicity is often lost. The body already knows how to enter this state. Every night, without instruction or discipline, awareness drifts towards sleep. Muscles relax. Thoughts lose their urgency. Control fades without effort. No one forces themselves into this transition successfully. It happens precisely because effort subsides. SATS belongs to this same territory. It is not reached by trying harder, but by allowing the familiar descent into stillness to occur without interference. This is why forcing imagery or emotion inside SATS often produces tension rather than acceptance. When the mind insists on doing it right, the body remains alert, guarded, and slightly contracted. The nervous system reads this as work, not rest. In that condition, assumption cannot settle, because the system is still signaling that something is missing and must be acquired. SATS, however, does not function as acquisition. It functions as recognition. Drifting into sleep offers the perfect analogy. Dreams are not manufactured through willpower. They arise when conscious control relaxes enough for the deeper layers of mind to speak. The same is true of assumption in SATS. When the body is allowed to feel what is already true without demand or urgency, the state imprints naturally. There is no need to push sensation or exaggerate feeling. The acceptance itself is the signal. This is where the body becomes the teacher. The intellect often wants proof, structure, and repetition. The body responds to coherence. When an assumed state is allowed to be felt quietly, without commentary, the body begins to respond as though it is already real. Muscular tension changes. Breathing deepens. The nervous system reorganizes around the new information. This happens without instruction because the body recognizes truth through consistency, not effort. Once forcing stops, resistance often surfaces. This resistance is not a sign of failure. It is the echo of old conditioning. The mind, accustomed to equating effort with value, becomes uneasy in stillness. It searches for something to correct, something to improve. Old doubts rise, not because assumption is weak, but because control is withdrawing. In this phase, the absence of effort feels unfamiliar, even unsafe, because it contradicts learned patterns. Yet this is precisely where SATS fulfills its purpose. In the absence of ritual, the state is allowed to stand on its own. There is no distraction of technique, no performance to maintain. Identity is felt directly, without explanation. The body receives the assumption as information rather than instruction. It is taught not through repetition, but through consistency of being. Over time, this changes the relationship with imagination entirely. Imagining no longer feels like work or practice. It becomes a quiet confirmation, something that happens in the same way memory happens. There is no urgency attached to it, no expectation that something must occur immediately to validate the experience. The state feels complete in itself, which is why it impresses so deeply. SATS without ritual restores trust between mind and body. It removes the hierarchy where the intellect tries to command the system into belief. Instead, it allows belief to settle naturally through calm recognition. In this space, assumption no longer feels like something being installed. It feels like something being remembered. And when the body accepts a state as already true, it carries that acceptance forward into waking life, not through effort, but through quiet, undeniable coherence. The mind was trained in a world where value is measured through exertion. From an early age, effort became the language of legitimacy. To receive without struggle felt suspicious, even wrong. This conditioning did not arise from malice. It arose from repetition. Rewards followed labor. Praise followed discipline. Over time, the nervous system learned a simple equation. No effort means no value. This equation did not stay confined to work or achievement. It quietly migrated into identity itself. When assumption enters this landscape, the mind reacts defensively. It does not resist because assumption is false, but because it violates the rules it learned to survive by. The idea that something could be accepted without proof of work feels like a breach of order. The mind demands evidence, steps, progress markers. It wants reassurance that value is being earned, not simply received. In this way, effort becomes a moral requirement rather than a practical one. This is why receiving without strain often triggers guilt. A gift accepted too easily creates discomfort, not because it is undeserved, but because it bypasses the familiar ritual of earning. The body tightens. Thoughts search for justification. Something inside insists that ease must be corrected, balanced, or repaid. This reaction reveals how deeply struggle has been associated with worth. Ease is not rejected because it fails, but because it contradicts conditioning. The mind positions itself as an adversary here, but not in the sense of an enemy. It is more accurate to see it as a gatekeeper protecting an outdated rule set. It believes that if effort is removed, order will collapse, control will be lost, identity will dissolve. And so it demands proof of work as a way to maintain continuity. If something is obtained through struggle, it feels real. If it arrives through assumption, it feels unearned and therefore unstable. This demand for proof creates a subtle tension that undermines assumption. Even when the state is accepted internally, the mind watches closely, waiting for external confirmation. It monitors circumstances, scans for signs, measures progress. This vigilance reintroduces separation because it implies that the assumption is not yet safe to rest in. The state becomes provisional, dependent on outcomes rather than settled within identity. Letting go of guilt is the turning point here. Guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing, it is evidence of conditioning loosening. When guilt arises in response to ease, it signals that an old belief is being challenged. The discomfort does not mean something is wrong. It means authority is returning to a place it has long been absent from. Authority does not negotiate with effort. It does not require permission. It simply is. As guilt dissolves, something quieter takes its place. There is a sense of internal permission that does not need to be defended. The mind no longer argues for struggle as proof of legitimacy. It begins to accept that value can exist without strain, that identity does not need to be justified through labor. This does not produce irresponsibility, it produces alignment. Action still occurs, but it is no longer driven by anxiety or the need to earn existence. The adversary loses power not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. When assumption is allowed to stand without explanation, the mind slowly adapts. It learns that reality does not fall apart when effort is removed. In fact, coherence increases. Events unfold with less friction. Decisions feel clearer. The system relaxes because it no longer has to maintain the performance of worthiness. This shift restores a deeper form of authority, one that does not rely on struggle to feel real. Authority rooted in assumption is quiet and stable. It does not announce itself or seek validation. It simply occupies space, and as this authority settles, the mind no longer demands proof of work, because it recognizes something more fundamental than effort has taken its place. When assumption settles into identity, movement begins without announcement. There is no internal signal confirming that life has shifted, no emotional surge demanding recognition. Instead, circumstances start to reorganize quietly, as though they had been waiting for permission. This is the bridge of incidents, not as a process to be controlled, but as a natural response to inner agreement. Life moves because resistance has been removed, not because effort has been applied. The bridge is often misunderstood as something that must be observed or guided. From an effort-based mindset, it appears logical to track progress or anticipate outcomes. Yet the bridge only functions smoothly when it is left alone. Once the state is accepted internally, movement no longer requires supervision. Interference introduces friction because it implies that the assumption is unstable and needs assistance. Alignment, by contrast, allows events to unfold without commentary. A conveyor belt offers a clear image. When a package is placed correctly, the system carries it forward automatically. Touching it mid-motion does not help. It disrupts the flow. In the same way, once an assumption is set without doubt, life begins to carry it forward. Encounters, decisions, and opportunities appear naturally, often in ways that feel ordinary rather than orchestrated. This ordinariness is not accidental. It is the sign that movement is aligned rather than forced. The most reliable indicator of this alignment is calm. Excitement fades quickly, and anxiety belongs to effort. Calm remains because there is no internal argument left to resolve. There is nothing to prove and nothing to fix. The bridge of incidents does not seek attention because it is not performing. It is responding to a settled state. When calm replaces urgency, manipulation loses its appeal. Decisions arise without strain, and movement feels obvious rather than strategic. Life does not need to be pushed once identity is clear. It rearranges itself naturally, reflecting the assumption that no longer questions itself. The Sabbath is not a rule or a practice. It is a condition of rest that appears when the inner struggle ends. It arises naturally when there is nothing left to fix, improve, or monitor. Attention withdraws from the process not through discipline, but because it is no longer needed. The state has been accepted, and acceptance requires no maintenance. As long as attention remains focused on how things are unfolding, there is an unspoken belief that something is unfinished. Monitoring keeps identity slightly outside the state, waiting for confirmation before fully settling. The Sabbath begins when this waiting dissolves, when anticipation gives way to quiet recognition. Nothing dramatic occurs. The mind simply stops circling the subject. Trusting an elevator captures this state clearly. Once the destination is selected, movement does not require assistance. Pulling cables or inspecting mechanisms would only imply doubt. In the same way, when assumption is complete, attention relaxes. Identity no longer participates in the process because participation would suggest uncertainty. This rest can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because conditioning equates attention with responsibility. To stop watching feels careless at first. Yet the Sabbath reveals a deeper truth. Identity sustains the state, not vigilance. When identity is clear, attention naturally softens. In this stillness, desire loses urgency. Wanting becomes knowing. The mind moves on, not because the desire vanished, but because it no longer needs reinforcement. Results arrive as quiet confirmations, often noticed after the fact. The Sabbath is the silence that follows certainty, where creation completes itself without resistance. Neville Goddard was never offering a technique, but exposing an identity. Assumption costs nothing because it is not something added to consciousness. It is consciousness. The belief that it must be earned through effort was never a law. It was a habit, formed through conditioning. Techniques were never the creative power. They served as reminders when trust wavered, nothing more. When reminders were mistaken for causes, effort replaced simplicity, and assumption was delayed instead of recognized. Neville's mirror analogy clarifies this completely. A mirror does not respond to effort directed at the reflection. It responds only to what stands before it. Reality follows identity in the same way. When identity changes, reflection has no choice but to follow. Modern language confirms the same principle. Joe Dispenza explains that effort fragments the system, while coherence organizes it. Force communicates lack. Coherence communicates possession. Creation responds to stability, not strain. When methods fall away, nothing valuable is lost. What disappears is the belief that worth must be proven and desire must be justified. What remains is being quiet and sufficient. This is the final recognition. Assumption is free because it was never a transaction. When effort ends, life does not stop. It responds. As Neville reminded us, you are already that which you are seeking. Subscribe if you're done paying for what's already yours.